Hello, everyone, and we're glad you can attend Attitude's weekly ADHD Experts webinar. This is the second of 3 webinars we are hosting for ADHD Awareness Month. The third, Life Hacks for a Successful ADHD Life, is scheduled for October 22nd. Just an introductory note before we get started. If you've listened to one of our webinars before, you know we've been experimenting with adding the certificate of attendance. When the webinar ends, a post-event survey will pop up. It will list 3 questions about the quality of the webinar, followed by 3 questions titled Required for Certificate. If you would like a certificate of attendance emailed to you, you should answer those 3 questions. If you don't want a certificate, then you don't have to answer them. Okay, well, today's topic is helping children and adults understand what ADHD is and empowering them to explain it to peers, other adults, and family. By doing so, they will be able to advocate for themselves, which is key. In too many cases, children and adults aren't given a basic education about the causes and symptoms of the condition when they are diagnosed. So they are often confused about what they are dealing with. Unfortunately, that often leads to feeling weird or broken or ashamed. We are happy to have expert Ryan Wexelblatt here to give kids, parents, teachers, and adults an education about ADD and the language to explain it to others. A firm understanding of ADHD leads to less shame and better symptom control. Ryan is a licensed clinical social worker and creator of the ADHD Dude YouTube channel and Facebook group. He provides coaching through ADHD Dude Coaching and is the director of Ride the Wave Counseling and Summer Trip Camp in Margate, New Jersey. You can ask questions of Ryan anytime during the webinar. We will try to get to as many of them as we can after his presentation. To download the presentation slides of this webinar, click the drop-down menu labeled Event Resources on the bottom left of your screen. If you do not see the Event Resources tab, you need to refresh the page. So now finally, let me turn it over to the expert himself, Ryan. Great to have you here today to help us with this important topic.
Thank you, Wayne. I'm really happy to be here, and I want to thank Attitude Magazine for hosting me again. I had such great feedback and so many great questions from my webinar in May, which you can still listen to, so I'm really glad to be doing this. So a few things about what we're going to cover today. So number one is I want to talk about how I explain ADHD to kids and give them the language to explain the diagnosis to their peers. We're going to talk about how parents can explain the condition to family members and friends who may see ADHD as a character flaw or can be judgmental about it. We'll talk about the downside of sugarcoating ADHD by calling it a superpower or gift. We'll talk about suggestions for fathers who may not believe in the diagnosis or think that their child's ADHD-related behaviors are intentional. And if you would like to get a PDF printable handout of this presentation when we're done, you can head over to tinyurl.com/ADHD handout. Okay, and you'll be able to see that again at the end. All right, so a little bit about my story. You can hear kind of more about my background if you watch my first webinar titled The Social Lives of Boys, which you can find on the Attitude Magazine ADHD and Boys page or on my author page. So I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I am a school social worker. I actually work in a school full time. I'm the father of a son in the picture here, which led me to the social learning field, or what people typically call the social skills field. My son basically lets me have one picture of us together per year. So this is our picture from last year. I'm hoping the next one will be soon. As Wayne mentioned, I'm the director of ADHD coaching and programs and Summer Trip Camp. I work with families all over the country, and the camp is located here in Margate, New Jersey. And I make videos for kids as well as parents at the ADHD channel, and they're also posted in the ADHD Facebook group. So something I just wanted to mention real quick is that my approach is something that I've created based on trainings that I sought out on my own, my experience and my specific approach. So unfortunately, I can't refer you to somebody in your area who does exactly what I do because this is my own creation. Okay. So to get started, one of the things I want everyone to think about is that language is the way we make meaning of the world and give context to our experiences. And the first thing I do with kids when I meet them is ask them what ADHD means. And most of the time they say, I have trouble paying attention. So what I do is I say, I find out what their favorite video game is. So I say, you have trouble paying attention when you play Minecraft. And they say no. And then that's how I kind of get into my, explanation of it. But one of the things that, I really want to mention here, I think is really important, that I find that kids are diagnosed, and even after the diagnosis, I would say 98% of the kids I've worked with have never had really a holistic understanding or explanation of ADHD, and their parents have not either. So it's really important to me to kind of put that information out there and kind of give them this more holistic understanding of what it means. So this is my general explanation of ADHD for kids, which I modify, of course, based on kids' age and cognitive ability. So I say, the prefrontal cortex, or for younger kids, I'll say the part of your brain in your forehead. That's the operating system of your brain, and it's developing a few years slower than the rest of your brain. And I explain that, everyone's brain has things that are easier to learn and harder to learn. And then the things that your brain might make harder to learn are really not things we teach. Because I want kids, as well as their parents, to understand that, when we put accommodations in place in school for kids through an IEP or through a 504 plan, there's nothing wrong with that at all. Okay, but really those are accommodations. They're things that often kids prompt dependent, because, in our society, we don't really provide teachers with the education and the training to address ADHD related challenges. Rather, we accommodate challenges, but don't teach strategies that would really be helpful. And that's kind of where I come in, and where great resources like Attitude Magazine comes in, help with. So this is the video game analogy I use with kids. And I'm just going to use Minecraft as an example here. So I say, if you try playing Minecraft on a computer in 2016, it might be a little glitchy because you're playing on an older operating system and you're playing the most recent version of Minecraft. And I say that, ADHD is kind of the same thing. The operating system for your brain is developing a little behind the rest of your brain, so, 2 to 3 years behind. So that makes it harder for your brain to do certain things. And I'm really clear with kids because I want them to understand that this has nothing to do with what you're good at, what kind of job you're going to have one day, or anything like that. Okay. So when I go on to explain, the things that ADHD can make it harder for your brain to do, I want them to have kind of specific things that they can relate to. So for one, I say, picturing things that you have to do in the future, planning. So I always ask kids, I say, have you ever done homework and forgot to hand it in? And when they say yes, which 98% or 99% of the time they do, I say, the reason that happened is because your brain you weren't picturing yourself handing in homework in your brain. And that's not, your fault, but that's one of the things that ADHD makes harder to picture things in your brain. The next thing I talk about is being able to feel time. And I say, I know you know how to tell time, but feeling time is different. So for instance, when you're doing something fun, like playing video games or watching YouTube, it might feel that you've only been doing it for a minute when you've really been doing it for a half an hour. And I explain the concept of hyperfocusing that. And I say, whereas on the other hand, if you have to do something like take the trash out, which will take less than 5 minutes, it might feel to you like it could take an hour because it's something that's not interesting. And if your brain makes it hard to feel time, then it's going to be harder to kind of get through things like that. The other thing I explain to kids is that, things that ADHD makes harder for your brain to do are thinking about other people's thoughts about what you're saying and doing. So really what that is perspective taking, right? It's understanding how you come across to others, but also being able to think about others' thoughts about your behavior, your words, based on the context of this. And the other thing that really resonates with parents I bring up with kids, I say that, ADHD can make it difficult for your brain from switching from doing something you like to doing something that's boring. So for instance, like getting off the computer to go take a shower, which is, one of the number one things I hear from parents that they fight about is that transition from preferred activity to non-preferred activity. And again, I explain to kids, I say that ADHD is a description of how your brain works. It is not your identity, and it is not a mental problem, because I've heard a lot of kids say that it's a mental problem. I also don't call ADHD a disability, although technically it is a neurodevelopmental disability. But the reason I don't say that is because I think just using the word disability is, it's disempowering when you're giving an explanation. So the main thing I want to convey to kids is the concept of self-directed talk, or what I call using your brain coach. So I say that the most important thing that ADHD makes it harder for you to do is use your brain coach, which is self-directed talk. And what I say to kids is that, ADHD means that the volume on your brain coach is turned down too low. And I explain your brain coach as, it's a thing that helps you get through things that are boring or not interesting. It's what helps you plan what to do. It helps you figure out what's happening in certain situations. It helps you, think about what you should say. So we use our brain coach for so many things throughout the day, and you have a brain coach. It's just that the volume is turned down too low. And I use that analogy because I want kids to understand that they have self-directed talk. They're just not always using it because they're not always hearing it. And I think that's kind of the way to make this, very kind of abstract concept a little more concrete, tangible. So, role of your brain coach, I explain, is, like I mentioned, it helps you get through things that are difficult. It helps you figure out what you're supposed to be doing. This is a big one. It helps you figure out what's a little problem, a medium problem, or a big problem. And the reason I bring that up is to address emotional regulation. So, I'll say, you ever yell at your parents about something and then realize afterwards, or yell at your friend and realize it wasn't a big deal and you feel kind of bad about that? And I say the reason that happens is because your brain makes it hard to figure out, what's a little, medium, or big problem. And again, if I know kids are struggling socially, I say, a big part of what your brain coach does is help you to figure out somebody else's thoughts about something before you say it. And the other way I describe that too is I say, think about this. Your brain coach is almost like a YouTube video that shows 5 seconds into the future, right? So before we say or do something, we're picturing in our brain what somebody might think or what they might say 5 seconds into the future. So if we're not doing that, and if our brain coach makes it hard to do that, then what happens is we tend to just say things or do things, that might offend or upset other people. So with that, I'm really trying to address impulsivity. Okay. So one of the things that I see in the ADHD field is, there's this tendency with some people to, call ADHD a superpower or a gift, and I've seen plenty of merchandise saying, I have a superpower, it's called ADHD and things like that. I don't like using those terms, and I'll tell you why. Because I think with kids, we have to use really clear language and not sugarcoat things, okay? And we have to be direct. And I think most kids will come to realize at some point in their life, if they haven't already, that ADHD is not a gift given the challenges it presents. And the other part with that is a superpower is not something you need to take medication to. The other thing I want to convey to kids is that being able to manage ADHD takes a tremendous amount of effort. I say to kids, I know you can do this, and it's going to be a lot of work. So I think when we kind of call it a gift or a superpower, that takes away the implication that, managing this is a lot of work on your. Okay. I do acknowledge that the way that ADHD can be helpful in terms of focusing on details, hyper-focusing on things that you enjoy, and how those things can help you at a job one day. But the other thing is that we need to get better at these things that your brain makes a little harder to learn or to, and that's what my job is. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the language I give to kids that explain ADHD to their peers. And really the idea with this and these examples I'm giving you is to kind of think about, if your son or daughter or your grandchild doesn't have the language to explain it, that's going to make things a little more challenging for them. Because what a lot of times kids with ADHD do is when they don't have the language to explain, ADHD, is they make self-defeating comments about themselves to other kids to kind of turn it into so they say things like, I'm stupid, I'm a spaz, that kind of thing. So these are just some things, and you can kind of pick and choose what you feel is age appropriate for your child, and kind of, you can even read these off to them and kind of say, which one do you think would be easiest for you to remember, or which one do you like best? So the idea is that they can kind of take ownership of this language, and explain it in a way that's most comfortable for them. So one example I use is, my brain makes it hard for me to picture what I'm supposed to be doing and to pay attention to things that I'm not interested in. So that's, why I always kind of space out during math class and the teacher always calls my name. Another one is ADHD can make it hard for you to think about the future before you do something. So that's why I call out in class a lot. So if you notice, what I'm doing here is I'm kind of attaching a common behavior to the explanation, because that helps other kids have context for understanding the behavior. And I want kids to have the language to give others context about why they do or say the things that they do. Okay. Another one is sometimes, my brain makes it hard for me to figure out the difference between a little problem or a medium problem or a big problem, and that's why I get really mad sometimes. Another one is, when you have ADHD, your brain makes it hard for you to pay attention or sit still for anything that you think is boring. So what I'm doing here is, I'm taking the focus kind of away from the kid in the sense that I'm giving more of a general explanation with ADHD, but then giving them the opportunity to give, like I mentioned, to give context to their experience and what other kids experience with being with them. Okay. And I really want to encourage you to, help your kids develop the language to explain this, because again, if they don't have the language and if they don't have an understanding of ADHD to begin with, they're just going to make self-defeating comments, to kind of laugh it off because they either feel ashamed or embarrassed. And, the last thing we want kids to do is feel ashamed or embarrassed about something that they can't. Okay, this is the explanation I give more for high school kids. So I, explain to them more about like the frontal lobe. And I say, that ADHD, I say you can explain it this way, that ADHD, that the operating system part of your brain called your frontal lobe or your frontal cortex is developing about 3 years slower than the rest of your brain. So it makes it hard to remind yourself of things that you need to do to get through boring things and think about what you say before you say it. Because again, with high school kids, what I want you to think about is the older we get, the more social expectations go up. Okay? And the older you get, the less kind of understanding and tolerance there are particularly for social faux pas. So I want kids to be able to really kind of explain this well, even at the high school level for kids, so they can be a little more empathetic and understanding about it. And again, because we want to move them away from kind of using self-defeating comments or negative language of saying, I'm stupid or I'm a spaz or whatever it is, because they don't have language to. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about explaining ADHD to family members. One of the things that I hear from parents a lot is that this is an area they struggle with, because sometimes family members can be a little judgmental, or they like to, maybe tell how to parent, or they like to share their opinions about what parents are doing wrong. So I want parents also to have a very clear and simple language and explanation they can give to other people, because I find when people don't have that, it makes it more difficult for people to kind of have empathy for kids and be a little more understanding. So I explained that ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disability, or I tend to call it a lot a neurodevelopmental challenge. It means that the frontal lobe, the self-control part of the brain, is developing about 3 years behind the rest of the brain. And this means that kids with ADHD, they may have lagging skills in one or more of these areas. Typically, it's multiple areas. So one is emotional regulation, or as I mentioned before, putting problem size in a relevant context. The next one is their ability to think in a social context. So I want you to notice I didn't say social skills here, because I think social skills is a very vague term. And a lot of times what happens with kids with ADHD is they gravitate towards younger kids because younger kids have less social expectations and they can control the play with younger kids, or they gravitate towards adults, particularly if they are the type to kind of have one-way conversations where they talk at people, because what they learn is that adults will be patient and tolerant with me. So a lot of times what happens with kids with ADHD have what I call social learning challenges, meaning they don't learn social information intuitively, is that they gravitate towards younger kids or they gravitate towards adults, and adults tend to think that their social skills are much more age appropriate than they are because they present well to adults. So one thing I want to mention about that is, as part of my admissions process for my summer camp is that I require feedback from a teacher, and in this questionnaire that I send to teachers, what I'm looking for is information to hear how kids look around their peers. So parents will say sometimes, well, he works with this psychologist, you want to talk to them? And I say, no, because the psychologist is not going to give me any information that will be helpful in me determining if he can be successful in my program. Because, think about this. When a child goes to a psychologist or whatever mental health professional, they're one-on-one with them. And again, if they are really good at speaking to adults, that could be misleading to the adult who doesn't see them around other peers. And at the end of the day, and this is really important, it's your peers who are the judge of your social skills. It is not adult. Okay, your peers are the ones who are going to judge if your social skills are, you have a level of social competency. Say. The other thing that I have parents explain is that a big piece of ADHD is that it makes it difficult to persevere through non-preferred tasks. So it's a lack of resiliency to persevere through non-preferred tasks. And the last piece, again, is that it makes it difficult to use self-directed talk, or we can explain to other people as your internal dialogue that we all have. One of the things that, I encourage parents is I encourage parents not really use the term executive functioning a lot. And I'll tell you why. Executive functioning is an umbrella term, and it's something I find that most people don't really understand because it's kind of a vague term. And I will tell you, I find even in schools, a lot of educators, they believe what an executive functioning means is your organizational skills as they apply to academic subjects. But really, executive functioning is a very broad term, and it's really global in the sense that it affects so many different areas of your life, not just academics. And the other thing I want parents to explain to family members is, and I should also mention, I explain this to kids and parents as well, that ADHD should really be called executive function developmental delay, because that is a much more accurate term. That's something I learned from Dr. Russell Barkley, and I want families to understand why that's more, of an accurate term, because, ADHD, when, means attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, not all kids with ADHD are hyper. So it's really kind of a misleading term. And I think we will get there to eventually call it executive function developmental delay. But for right now, people still do not have a good understanding of what executive functioning means, which is why I encourage parents to, often stay away from that term when they explain ADHD to friends or family members. Okay, so when I hear about family members being judgmental or friends being judgmental, what I encourage parents to do is explain to them, that you can't speed up the development of the frontal lobe or your prefrontal cortex by being stricter or punishing a child. Because that's one of the number one things I hear from parents is they say, that family members say, well, if you were just stricter with him, or if you would punish him more, then he would learn. Okay? They don't understand that that's not going to speed up your development of your executive functioning. Okay? And the other thing, which I don't even really get into, is explaining that, kids with ADHD have difficulty with episodic memory, meaning they don't always associate their past experiences and emotions with those past experiences and apply that information to the present. So when, family members say, well, he does the same things over and over, you can explain, well, this is, difficulty with episodic memory. But again, that's kind of an abstract concept, I think, for people to understand unless they're really familiar with it. I also encourage parents to help explain to family members and friends that ADHD is on a continuum from mild to severe, and kind of help people understand where their son or daughter fits in on that continuum if they have a sense of it, because that gives people some context for understanding the severity of their symptoms as well, and it can help people to be more understanding. So one of the things that I want you to think about is to really think about ADHD as a continuum rather than three separate profiles. To my knowledge, in the European medical model, ADHD is seen as more of a continuum, whereas in the United States, we have, these three distinct types. We have inattentive ADHD, combined type, and then just, the hyper impulsive only type. Personally, I have never seen any kid in my career who is just hyper and impulsive but can pay attention. So I really don't know where that came from. So I think this graphic is much more helpful for families to understand that ADHD ranges from, the mild inattentive profile. And I have seen kids with that profile. And to be honest, there's a segment of those kids who are the only ones who I've seen who can be successful without medication. Anybody else beyond kind of that very left tip of the arrow usually requires medication to be successful. Then at some point as we move further along here, we get into the moderate or inattentive profile that also includes hyperactivity. And then on the other end, we have the more severe inattentive and impulsive profile. The other variables we have to take into consideration here and help family members to understand is, is anxiety part of your child's profile? We know that about 30% of individuals with ADHD also present with anxiety. And some people believe that that number is low. And I agree with that because, you know, a lot of males in particular do not articulate anxiety. They might not even have the language to do that. And one of the things, you know, I want to talk about real quick is that I work with a lot of guys who have social anxiety. And when I explain social anxiety to kids, one of the things I say to them is, you know, this is not something that boys talk about. You know, have you ever heard a kid in school talking about their anxiety or saying they have social anxiety? And of course, kids always say no. But the really important thing is that I find when I teach kids about social anxiety, they think they are the only one in the world who has it, because this is not something that is talked about, particularly amongst boys. So we have to help family members understand how anxiety may or may not play have a piece in this in terms of behavior, because one of the things that's really important is anxiety affects behavior greatly. Okay, learning disabilities can also affect behavior greatly. Kids with slower processing, you know, might act silly because they're embarrassed of their slower processing or because they can't keep up with what's going on. You know, kids, I've seen a lot of kids who have difficulty with reading or with dyslexia act out in class or act silly because they feel so ashamed of their difficulty with reading. So for those kids, you know, we have to not only explain the continuum of ADHD, we also have to explain how things like anxiety or learning disabilities or sensory issues play a piece in their profile as well. The one thing I want to also clarify with this real quick is that, you know, I see a lot of kids being diagnosed with sensory processing. And I want people to understand that there's a difference between having sensory issues and having sensory processing disorder. Okay. So my son, for instance, has sensory issues. You know, he doesn't like mushrooms and he doesn't like loud music and mushy foods and this and that. Okay. That does not mean he has sensory processing disorder. And what I'm finding and what some of my colleagues in the OT, the occupational therapy field, have shared with me is they are seeing that sensory processing disorder is being overdiagnosed at a really significant. So I just wanted to mention that as well. Okay. This is another graphic I use that you can show family members. And this will also be available on the ADHD Do Business page as well as a Facebook group after the presentation. This is a sample developmental chart of a 12-year-old with. So if you look on the left here, what you'll see is, you know, ages. And at the bottom here across is developmental areas. So the developmental areas I have listed are physical maturity, language skills, emotional maturity, social maturity, and executive functioning. Now, theoretically, we can put, you know, emotional maturity and social maturity maybe under executive functioning, but I want to parse that out as a separate. So let's take a sample, you know, just a typical 12-year-old. Well, in terms of his physical maturity, he might look about 13. In terms of his language skills might be off the chart. They might be well above age 15. But in terms of his emotional maturity, his social maturity, and his executive functioning, is at the level of a 9-year-old. Okay, because as we said, with ADHD, there's a 2 to 3 year delay in these skills. So what do people in our society tend to judge other kids by? They tend to judge by their physical appearance. So if you look older, you know, for your age, we assume a certain level of maturity, but we also judge kids by their language skills. So if we meet kids who are articulate or who are really good at making compelling arguments for things, that what happens is people tend to mistake that as maturity or rational judgment. And I can't tell you how many kids I've seen throughout my career who have really solid language skills. And what happens is they find ways to get out of non-preferred tasks or things that make them anxious because they can present a really compelling argument to their parents, and their parents mistake that for maturity or rational judgment. So in our society, right, these are the two things that we really judge kids by. We look at their physical appearance and their language skills. Okay. And what we have to really do is kind of look at the bigger picture of this. You know, the other thing I will tell you real quick is that in my experience, educators tend to have expectations of self-regulation skills. Their expectations tend to be based on kids' physical appearance and their language skills. So they think, you know, he's so smart. Why can't he control himself better? Your language skills have nothing to do with your executive functioning, you know, in these areas, or your impulse control or your social maturity. You know, and language, not to get into this right now, but language is based in executive functioning, but there are kids who have really solid language skills and advanced language skills, but still struggle with executive function. So what I want you to do is kind of think about your child in terms of this developmental chart. And what you need to explain to people is that we need to meet them where they're at in terms of their emotional maturity, their social maturity, and executive functioning, okay? Because that's where their skill level's at. What their physical appearance or their physical maturity is at has nothing to do with it. Their language skills can make it easier sometimes to discuss things, but again, at the end of the day, that's not what is relevant here. What is most relevant is these other areas that they're lagging behind, because that's what we need to address. The last thing I want to say about this real quick is the number one comment I hear from parents is, we've tried therapy and it wasn't helpful. Many parents share with me they've tried therapy multiple times and it wasn't helpful. And I think part of the reason for that, I have a few reasons, but number one, I say therapy was not designed with boys in mind. I say therapy was definitely not designed for boys with ADHD. But the other thing is that if a kid has really solid language skills, they can really impress a mental health professional with their language skills. And because the mental health professional is only kind of hearing secondhand typically about their lagging executive functioning and their social learning challenges, emotional maturity, it's hard for mental health professionals to have a really comprehensive picture, because they tend to, again, look at the language skills. And let's face it, in our society, myself included, I got no training in ADHD when I went through graduate. For most teachers I meet, and even, neuropsychologists, very, very few people get any training in ADHD, or I should say get adequate training in, which is why for myself, I really had to look outside of the mental health field to get the training that I wanted. So much of the training I've done has actually come from the speech language pathology field, as well as occupational therapy. A quick shout out to the speech therapists, speech paths, and the occupational therapist. Okay, so a few more things I think is helpful to give family members or friends a relevant context for understanding ADHD. It's hard for people to see ADHD-related challenges because people with ADHD look like everybody else. And when people do not present with challenges that are clearly apparent to other people, people then tend to be less empathetic and understanding than they would be with somebody who has noticeable challenges. So let me give you an example really quick. When somebody has Down syndrome, people are almost automatically going to be empathetic and understanding with them because they have some noticeable, differences. For individuals with autism who kind of have some features that are easy to see, whether that's, flapping or rocking or whatever it might be, people tend to be more understanding with them. And one of the things I want to mention here is that often I have found, and let me say I have a long background in working with individuals with Asperger's. I know it's not called that anymore. I still call that, but with Asperger's and higher verbal autism. And I have this credential called Certified Autism Specialist. I can tell you from my personal experience, I've seen the same behaviors in individuals with higher verbal autism, particularly when they make social faux pas, that when those same behaviors are in kids with ADHD, people tend to look at those behaviors in kids with ADHD as a character flaw or a choice, whereas when kids with autism or Asperger's do those same behaviors, people tend to excuse them more and say, oh, well, that's just part of his autism. Right? So I want you to think about how our society judges differently based on their appearance, but also in the diagnostic label they had. And there's a lot of thinking that ADHD related challenges are choices. And obviously that's just not accurate a lot. So if you find that a family member or friend is really being judgmental, what I want you to explain is that, your son or daughter's, their behavior is never an excuse. It's an explanation for why he or she does the things that they do. And the other thing I would say, and this is a little confrontational, but you could say, if he had autism, would you be saying this? That's also a neurodevelopmental disability. But again, people don't kind of associate ADHD as a neurodevelopmental disability, which it is. And sometimes they need to hear that it is. So I just wanted to talk real quick about some terms I don't use. So there's a newer term that's kind of become more popular, executive function disorder. So sometimes I'll have families reach out to me and they say, my son has ADHD and executive function disorder. And I say, no, if you have ADHD, you have an executive function developmental delay. They are not two separate things. There are people who have executive function challenges because of maybe a brain injury, or there's tons of things, which I'm not going to get into right now. But I want you to understand that if you have ADHD, you have an executive function developmental delay, you do not have a separate diagnosis called executive function. Okay. Another term that I personally do not use is oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD. And my feeling is that ODD is a description of behaviors that are a manifestation of inflexible thinking, anxiety, lack of resiliency to persevere through non-preferred tasks, or often some type of trauma. Okay. So the difference between ADHD and ODD is that there's a neurological basis for ADHD. And while there's some thought that there is also a neurological basis for ODD, right now what it still is a description of these behaviors. So I don't use that term personally. Another term I don't use is social cues. So a lot of times parents will say to me, my son doesn't read social cues. And what I explain to them is that difficulty with what I call social thinking skills, the ability to think in a social context, it goes much, much deeper than not reading social cues. It has to do with difficulty with perspective taking, with situational awareness, with being able to relate to others' emotional experiences, with being able to ask for help and clarification, what we often call self-advocacy skills. So that's why I don't use social as a term, because social learning challenges, the term I do use, is so much deeper than that, and there's so much more to it. What I want to encourage you to do also is, when you describe your child's profile to people, say that, he has ADHD and this is what it looks like, rather than rattling off like 4 different diagnoses, some of which are very subjective. When people submit questions for me to answer through the Attitude Magazine ADHD and Boys section, a lot of times what I see is people will list 5 or 6 diagnoses. And, I encourage them to look at this all as part of the puzzle, and also understand that you could go to 4 different people and get 4 different diagnoses. Okay. So one of the last things I want to mention here is, I sometimes will hear from moms that their son's father, their husband, doesn't believe in ADHD or thinks it's an excuse. So this is what I say to those guys. I say that the existence of ADHD is a scientific fact. It is not debatable. Okay, so to deny ADHD or say you don't believe it is basically denying science. But I also explain to them that when we were growing up, ADHD was rarely diagnosed. And if it was diagnosed, it was rarely talked about or explained to kids beyond just, you have trouble paying attention or have trouble sitting still. So I explained to them, that it's always been around. The first mention of ADHD was in the late, 1796, something like that, I think. And what I want them to understand, really the most important piece, is that not learning about ADHD or denying it exists is most likely going to impair your relationship with your son or your daughter, because they are going to feel very misunderstood. And I encourage them to watch the videos on my ADHD channel explaining ADHD, and I have some videos there that are specifically for fathers. Actually, I think the video with the most views there is the one that I made specifically for fathers. The other thing I want to mention is that the articles I post are always written with fathers in mind, because I want to make the information I present as practical as possible for dads. So real quick, just some things I have coming up. I am going to be having some online courses for parents coming out in the near future. I also post new content each week on the ADHD Dude social media, so the YouTube channel, the Facebook group, and Instagram. And I'm also available for trainings and speaking. One of the things I want to mention is this school year, I'm really focusing on videos for kids. So the videos where I speak directly to kids are under the Dude Talk playlist on the YouTube channel. And last thing I want to mention real quick is that I'm not operating, I am a licensed clinical social worker, but I'm not operating in a clinical capacity here. So I cannot provide clinical consultation or advice through email, Facebook Messenger, or the phone. Okay. So if you would like to watch my videos where I answer parents' questions, you can head over to the Attitude Magazine ADHD and Boys section, or you can go to this shortened URL here, tinyurl.com/Ryan Attitude. And if you would like a printable PDF of this presentation, you can go to the same thing, ADHD Dude handout there, and you'll be sent a printable PDF. And please make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. I think you'll find it really helpful. I've been getting a lot of great feedback from parents from their kids who have watched the Talk videos. You're welcome to join the Facebook group if you're not there already. And of course, follow me on Instagram. And my 2 websites are right there below. And again, I want to thank Attitude Magazine for having me today. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I'm happy to take some questions if we have time.
We have plenty of questions for you,
Great.
Ryan. And that was excellent, I want to add. a lot of insight that parents can use. First question, when is the right time to talk to your kids about ADHD? I don't want them to go through life with a label, but your point about advocating for themselves is really important.
I think that's a great question. So what I tell parents is when you should talk to them is as a get the diagnosis. And here's why. Because when parents don't talk to them about the diagnostic label, kids don't have a context for understanding how their brain works then. So what I've seen happen with kids whose parents don't discuss the label with them is they go through life feeling like there's something wrong with them because they have no context for understanding this is why certain things are harder for me than my brother or sister or for other kids. Okay, I think it's really important to give kids context for understanding how their brain works so they don't feel that there's something wrong with them and they realize that this is something that they can work with. So I would say as soon as possible.
Another question from a mom. Yes, a mom. What language do you recommend to explain ADHD to a sibling who views the child with ADHD as getting special treatment by their parents? Do you have any approach to that?
Wow, I love that question. Yeah. So I think it's important with siblings. We acknowledge how they feel. Okay. And we listen to their concerns and we validate them and we don't dismiss them and we don't say, no, you're just seeing it that way. Okay. Because this is very real to them. They, and a lot of times siblings, they feel jealousy and a lot of times they feel tremendous resentment towards their sibling. So the first thing is we have to really acknowledge how they feel. And then what I encourage you to do is explain that, his or her brain works differently than yours and, show them the graphic that I made, with the developmental chart or with the arrows, because I think when kids can have a visual, that helps things make sense more to them, and help them to also understand that, when he or she is older, this is going to be a lot better, most likely, but, it is what it is for now. And you're valid and it's okay if you feel the way that you do.
Mm-hmm. How do you, one thing we sort of didn't address, or maybe you did, and I missed it, hyperactivity. How do you explain a child's hyperactivity to him?
Yeah. So one of the things, I think I heard Ned Hallowell explain it this way, that, I think he uses the analogy of saying, your brain is like a Ferrari. It's like a really fast sports car, but the rest of your brain is, I don't remember exactly how he explained it, but what I say to kids is I say, part of your brain, it makes it hard for you to kind of sit still because you kind of always want to move around a lot. Okay. And and that doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It just means that you like to move a lot. And unfortunately we don't really our culture doesn't allow for kids to like to move a lot to move all the time. Because again, I want to take the pathology out of this and help them understand that this is just how they are, and it's really our society is not particularly accommodating of it. But that being said, we do have to learn, some strategies to help us with self-regulation and help us, be calm and pay attention and sometimes sit for things that are really boring. So I think, again, it's just acknowledging it and saying that it's okay, but we have to learn some strategies to help with it.
Mm-hmm. There was a lot of comment about the frontal lobe being 3 years behind, and does that imply that the kids will be normal in 3 years, or will they be 3 years behind forever? I guess some parents are asking about how to make that transition from, does the frontal lobe mature, and will they have ADHD forever? I mean, will it be 3 years behind forever, or will they catch up?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I explain to both kids and parents the first time I speak with them is that the frontal lobe is not done developing for anybody until you're about 25, 26. It's the last part of the developing. So if we're talking about that, ADHD means that your frontal lobe is developing about 3 years, 2 to 3 years behind the rest of your brain. It means that that part of your brain is not going to be done developing until you're about, 28, 29. So that being said, it's really hard to say, how ADHD will affect anybody as an adult. What we do know is that hyperactivity and impulsivity tends to subside with brain development and with age, but not completely. One of the things I'll mention to you is one of the ways in which I see that, impulsivity affects adults with ADHD is a lot of times with spending money. They tend to sometimes compulsively spend money that they don't have. So it's really hard to say, but what we know is that, yes, hyperactivity and impulsivity tends to get better as they get older. And for many individuals, the inattentiveness tends to get better as well. But there is no way to really predict any of this. The other thing I want to mention to parents is that there are many, adults with ADHD who struggled socially as a kid because of their social learning challenges, and they still present with social learning challenges today. So the more we can educate ourselves and kind of be proactive about this, I think the better, because that was kind of a long way of saying is that we can't really predict the future, but in many cases, ADHD symptoms do improve with age and with brain development.
Mm-hmm. This mom is talking about her 8-year-old daughter who frequently says there's something wrong with me because I have ADHD, or she'll tell other kids I have ADHD. Like something is wrong. Despite my comments, doctors' comments, and other people's comments, she persists in this. How can I help her?
Yeah. So one of the things I think is important here is not to try to constantly reassure her, know that there's nothing wrong with you. Okay. If you've explained ADHD in a really clear and concise way to her, okay, then I would say to her, when you tell other people that, their thoughts they have about you are that there maybe is something wrong with you, but there really isn't. And my guess is, and I can't be sure, that maybe this girl is saying that as a way to kind of get attention, or because she wants, people to say, no, you're not, you're okay. A lot of times kids make self-defeating comments because they want reassurance from others, but often, that doesn't kind of fulfill them. So I think the most important thing to do is help her understand others' thoughts about her when she says it. Help her again explain that this has to do with brain development, and how common ADHD is. And the third thing I would say is, don't try to constantly reassure her she's okay, because that is something that has to develop internally within her. And also, you don't want to give it more attention than required, because if she becomes kind of this, magnet for reassurance or for praise by being negative, that gets into kind of a negative pattern that you don't want to get in.
Mm-hmm. What's the best way to assess the severity of ADHD? One parent wants to know. I mean, you gave us that chart and you said it's a continuum, but is there any thoughts you can shed on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a really hard question to answer for reasons. Number one, because the severity question is really subjective. But I think the best way to kind of get a sense of it is to look at, to speak with a medical professional, and you can ask them, say, in terms of the kids you see with ADHD, where does my son or daughter kind of fit in on this continuum from mild to severe? One of the things that I mentioned is that anybody with just really an inattentive profile, or what we used to call ADD, that is what I consider to be more mild. And, again, with the severity piece, it really kind of depends of how the symptoms manifest themselves as well. So I don't think that you can kind of just make a determination if you don't have kind of a frame of reference for it. And the way I kind of determine it, just very, informally, is really kind of look at a kid and kind of look at the whole picture of these different skill areas in contrast to others their age whom I've worked with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. A couple of people have asked about how you explain medication to children when you're explaining the symptoms of ADHD. Yeah.
So in terms of medication, what I explain to kids is that, medication, first of all, I want them to understand that it's that kind of think of it as a Band-Aid, okay? Because I don't want them to think that they're dependent on medication. So I say that medication is something that, kind of helps your brain, slow down a little bit so you can hear your brain coach a little better. And it's kind of a Band-Aid, to use, but it's not something, it can't fix you, and it's not meant to fix you, and it can't make ADHD go away. It's just a Band-Aid to kind of help slow your brain down a bit and make certain things a little easier, like sitting still in class or paying attention, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we know that ADHD is genetic, and let's say the parent, the father or the mother has ADHD. Can that somehow factor into the explanation to the child?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think if a parent is diagnosed and they want to share that there's, definitely a genetic component with this, I think that's absolutely appropriate. And I think what would also be helpful for kids to hear if they have a parent who's diagnosed is things that the parent has kind of learned on their own to help them, what strategies they've used. And not saying that kids necessarily will want to use those strategies or kind of take them on. But I think it's important for kids to hear from parents that this is something that you can deal with because I've learned to deal with it and be successful. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a positive scenario. Yeah. How do you educate a teacher on ADHD and impulsivity? Apparently, the teacher believes the actions are deliberate that the kid is committing in the classroom. So,
yeah, I had to take a sigh before I answer this. That is unfortunately something I hear a lot. And what I want parents to understand is, again, teachers not giving any training or education really in ADHD. Even special ed teachers are given almost no information in ADHD. So what I want you to think about is that if a teacher kind of takes this attitude that his behavior is intentional or he can do the work, he's just being lazy, whatever it is, they see it as a character flaw. I want you to try to not take it personally because, what they're saying is a result of their lack of education or information. And one of the things that I think is a really great resource is that on the CHAD website, so if you're not familiar with CHAD, Children and Adults with ADHD, they have a teacher resource card that was made by some of my colleagues in the Philadelphia chapter. I believe they made it. And it's just a really great resource for to help them understand ADHD. It's not like a ton of information, but it's really the important stuff they need. And so if you look on the CHAD website for your information card, I think you'll be able to find it.
Okay. Yeah, that's good reference. That's a very good reference. I've been there and seen it. And
I'm sorry, Wayne, just one more thing too.
Yeah.
And obviously, feel free to send the Attitude website because there is a plethora of amazing information on the Attitude website. So I think that's a really great resource to share with teachers too. I wouldn't do it constantly, but say, oh, by the way, here's a really great resource, and maybe just kind of send them a link for something that is relevant to something they brought up with, and kind of use that as an intro to help educate.
Right.
Yeah.
One of those fathers you were talking about, as a father with 2 daughters with ADD, I believe that ADD is real. How do I make sure that ADD is not used as an excuse by my daughters for all their bad behavior? A child with ADD can still be held accountable for some behavior, right?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why one of the things I also kids, I say that, again, ADHD is not an excuse. Okay, it's an understanding of why your brain works the way you do. Okay, but if you do something hurtful to somebody, or if you say something mean to your parents, or you're disrespectful, you still are accountable for that, and you still need to apologize and make amends. So yes, kids can be held accountable, but what I really want parents to keep in mind is that punishment is not going to always change behavior. But I am also not opposed to consequences because there are consequences in life for. And something I want to mention real quick with this, I see sometimes in the ADHD world, there's a propensity with some parents to say punishment is never the answer. And if your child grows up thinking that there's never consequences in life or anything, that's going to be a problem in my experience. Okay, so So what we really want to teach is accountability and responsibility, regardless of having a diagnosis.
Yeah. One mom is talking about her son not accepting help in school or when doing homework. And she's wondering how she possibly explains that within the context of ADHD symptoms. I mean, he's sort of a teen and very resistant to any help at all. How could she possibly explain this to him without, getting him to buy in?
Yeah. So one of the things, I think is really important for parents to be able to explain to kids is that, when somebody's brain works with ADHD, it can make it hard for your brain to be flexible sometimes. And notice that through this, and right now I'm using the language saying your brain instead of you, because I want to take the focus away from saying that, you're inflexible to saying your brain makes it hard for you to be inflexible, because I want kids to feel that they have the power to change that, which they do. So what I would say to this parent is, help your son to understand that, ADHD can make it hard for his brain to be flexible when he needs help. Okay. And as he gets older, what I find, especially with teenagers, is there tends to be a tipping point around age 14, 15, where kids have a propensity to become more inflexible. So, I think it's important he understands that everybody in life needs help for things. The person who created Fortnite needed help with that. Everyone needs help for certain things, and we all need to make our brains be flexible sometimes to accept help. That is not a thing just for him. That's for anybody in life who wants to be successful.
Mm-hmm. I know this isn't your prime group you work with, but an adult wants to know how to possibly explain ADHD in the workplace to his boss, or do you have any thoughts about that, or is that just that's sort of out of your bailiwick?
Yeah. So to be honest, that would take me a little time to think about because I don't work with adults. But I think that's a really important thing for adults to remember is that, for those of us who are adults, most of us did not grow up with an understanding of ADHD. And many people think it's something that just kids have. So I think the best thing to do is explain to somebody's boss, say, look, I just want you to understand, I've been tested or I was evaluated, with ADHD, and here's what it looks like. And I think it's really important to give, employers, a very clear picture of what it could look like within the context of the workplace. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really the best thing you can do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This family, apparently not all family members are on board with feeling good about ADHD, and they're making the child ashamed of having it. So this would be, how do you sort of address or mitigate or talk with family members who are, the parents are good, but apparently some aunts and uncles are not understanding ADHD and making the child feel bad. How do you get them aside and sort of straighten them out?
Yeah. Well, I think, take the information that I shared in this presentation and be able to explain it as a neurodevelopmental disability and use some of the talking points that I outlined here. But I think the more important point here is not to try to convince adults, but how to kind of, protect your child from these comments. And what I would explain to the child in a developmentally appropriate way is that, if aunt whoever or uncle whoever, if they say things to you, it's because they don't really understand ADHD, because when they were growing up, people didn't understand ADHD. So it's hard for them to understand why it's a real thing. So when they say things to you, they're not saying it to be mean. They're saying it because they don't understand it. Okay. Mm-hmm. And what your job is to not kind of, make comments about it, but just understand that they're not doing it to hurt your feelings. They're doing it because they just don't really get it. And I think you have to be transparent with kids about that. Look, sometimes adults can be much more inflexible than kids can, and that's reality.
Mm-hmm. This harkens back, perhaps, I just wanted to get this in. This will probably be the last question because it sounds so poignant. My son does a lot of self-talk. You were talking about the brain coach, but it tends to be during stressful situations, and it's very negative. I constantly tell him how smart he is and use positive reinforcement, genuinely, but he still tends to be very negative on himself, saying things like, I'm so stupid, I don't belong here, I don't want to go to school, I want to get out of this reality, I want to go live in the woods. She just wants to know what she should do, how she should approach it.
Well, the first thing I think is important to understand is that when your son is in that frame of mind, he can't learn, okay? So trying to provide him with reassurance when, we're kind of changing the thought process when he's making self-defeating comments is going to do nothing. And I appreciate your effort in wanting to do that, okay? But he's not in a space to learn right there, okay? And what you have to kind of take into consideration is those self-defeating comments may be in the moment because how he's feeling, okay? But they are not a reflection of how he's feeling all the time. So what you can do is a while after this happened, after he's calm, say, do you still think those things about yourself, or were you just saying it because you were upset at the time? And if it was because he was upset at the time, say, that's okay, but what's important is, we don't say them, in front of other kids, because that can give them uncomfortable thoughts about us. One of the concepts I teach kids, I just want to talk about real quick, is what I call emotional compression, meaning you can feel however you want, but you cannot always show how you feel because it makes other people feel uncomfortable. So most kids I see with ADHD, they will not kind of make all the self-defeating comments in school. They know better. What they tend to do is do it more at home. And a lot of times what I will tell you is when they do it at home, it's because they're looking for some kind of reassurance to say, no, you're not. No, you're not. But again, that doesn't change their thoughts, right? They have to develop that, internal thought process themselves. So what we have to do is really kind of, when they're calm and able to learn, kind of challenge those negative thoughts if they say they do have them regularly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great advice. Yeah. Very good. I think the hour's up, and I appreciate you being here. You provided loads of expertise and perspective and insights, and I know I learned a lot in the process. So thanks again, Ryan, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And thanks to all of the attendees for being here. Hope you guys will attend next week's webinar on October 16th, when Susan Yellen will present a parent's guide to evaluating and troubleshooting your child's IEP or 504 plan. We can certainly all use help with that, so it ought to be a good one. And we hope to see you there. Thanks for attending today's webinar, and have a great day, everyone.